Hey everyone, welcome to my studio. Today we're painting 3 beautiful tulips in a small glass cylindrical vase. It might look a bit intimidating, but I think you will have fun and be successful with this painting. I'm starting out with a rectangle, 8.5 centimeters by 2 centimeters. I then draw the ellipse, or kind of like a squish circle or oval at the bottom, so it looks like a round object. You don't need the entire ellipse, just put in that bottom curved line. Then you do the same with the top. You just want that top curved line just to show that 1/2 of the ellipse at the top. You don't need both of it. I'm just showing you what it would look like, but you just need that front curved line at the top and at the bottom. Now the tulips are in a bit of an arch, which makes them seem balanced, at least to me. So I'm going to be making them a little bit bigger than the painting that you see on the right, my practice painting. And the first shape to create the tulip is an oval. So each tulip starts off as an oval and then has a stem that goes all the way down into the vase. At the very bottom of the base, there is thicker glass. I've noticed this in a lot of different glass vases, that at the bottom of them, they have a bit of thicker glass. So I'm drawing that curved line to represent that, so that I know where to stop each of the tulip stems, so that they don't go past that thick part of glass where they need to stop in the painting. And then for the leaves, I'm following the same shape of leaves that I have in my practice painting. They are a bit wavy and pointed as well. You can create your leaves any way you would like. This just looked balanced to me and not too simple. So for the first petal, I'm adding one large one in the front. And at first I was thinking I would have them that little M shape at the top, but then I ended up changing my mind in the end. So I'm adding 3 petals to this tulip, adding the 3 petals to the original oval that it started with, one large one in the front, and then 2 smaller ones, one on each side. But you can make your petals look however you would like. Tulips look different from every angle, so you really can't go wrong putting in the petals however you would like them to be. If you painted with me in our last tulip tutorial, you'll recognize the next 2 tulips that I'm going to be putting in. So it will follow that same pattern of the one large petal in the center, which is made from the oval, a petal on each side, going up the center, curving to the side, and then down following the curve of the oval. And then the same thing on the other side, where it's going down the center, or close to the center with a little curve on the end, and then the side of that tulip kind of follows that curved line of the center oval petal. We make that M shape in the back, the 2 arches that kind of look like the shape of an M. For the tulip on the left-hand side, it starts off with the oval again, and then an elongated S shape going down the middle, and then following the shape of the oval on the side. It just comes out a little bit at the top from the shape of the oval. And then it's done the same way for the next petal, with the elongated S going down the middle, and then the other side of that petal following the curve of that center oval. And then in the back, again, the M shape with the 2 arches. And then when you're done, you'll erase your extra lines and give some attention to the stems, making sure that they are the right thickness. Tulips tend to have a bit of thicker stems, so I just wanted to make sure that I captured that correctly. And then we're bringing those stems all the way down into the glass, and this is where we will draw in the water line. The water line just follows that same arch as the very top of the cylinder of the vase, and then it goes around so it makes kind of a squished oval shape. So for this, you will see some of the back of it, but you'll want to erase the ellipses where it's behind the tulips. So you'll want to draw this in probably more lightly than I'm drawing it in. I'm drawing it in pretty darkly so that you'll be able to see it in the video, but you want to draw it in very lightly. So you have that ellipse that matches that same swoop as you have on the top. You have that same arch on your ellipse for the water. So sometimes this water is highlighted by the sunlight, so it could be a brighter spot, bright white, and then sometimes it's a bit of a shady spot. For the picture that I'm working off of, that water, that ellipse, that oval is actually the brighter spot. So you'll want to keep that that white color of the paper. And then for the stems, when they hit the water, they actually look much bigger. When you look at flower stems in water, they look about twice the size of the stem before it hits the water, and they're also slightly to the left or the right of the stem. I wouldn't be too worried about that part. I would just make sure that you make it bigger, so it looks like the stem is hitting the water, and then you have that illusion of the stems being twice as thick once they're in the water. So we are finally done with all of the drawing. The next step is to make a wash of that really pretty rose color. The rose color that I'm using the Rosa Gallery Botanical 28 colors, using about 5 brushfuls of water and then a little bit of the Madder Rose color. You can see the palette, the white ceramic palette that I'm using. I have colors that have dried from my practice painting. So if you have a palette that you have dried colors on, I would suggest just re-wetting them and using them again, as long as you keep it covered to keep the dust out. That way you can you don't have to wash out your palette if you want to use those colors again. So for this first petal, I'm making sure to fill the entire petal with that light wash of Madder Rose, and then going into the pan of paint, that same Madder Rose, and dabbing in all along the edge of the petal and up the center of the petal that deeper color, so that it will blend in really softly with that still wet Madder Rose wash. It gives you that really pretty wet on wet blending effect. While that's drying, we'll go back into the Madder Rose wash. I rinse off my brush just to make sure that I don't have a really dark, deep color on there. Go into the Madder Rose wash and fill in the entire petal. so that I can achieve the same effect as the first petal, where we go back into the pan of the Madder Rose and then tap in that color up the center of the petal or down the center of the petal and then up the sides, so that it will have that same wet on wet soft blending effect and not leave the harsh lines. What I'm doing now is I rinsed off my brush, dabbed it dry on the paper towel, so it's still damp, but it's not soaking wet, and that way you're able to manipulate the color a bit, soak up some of that color if you have just a little bit too much. And then I'm going for that second petal of that same tulip and coloring it in the same way, with first the wash and then the deeper straight color from the pan, up the side of the petal and down the middle of the petal a bit, and then up the other side a little bit as well. And then I dab in just a little bit more towards the base of the petal. This next tulip I've sped up as it's done in the same way with the washes, and then dabbing in the thicker paint up the center and on the sides of the petal. And I do it the same way for both of these first petals. So next I'm going into the cadmium lemon yellow. You can use any yellow you have for this, or you can skip the yellow and go right to the green. But I like using yellow as a first layer, or also called an underpainting, when I want the color to have a warm glow to it. And so I'm starting out with a light yellow and painting down the stems all the way down into the water. Don't worry about the stems in the water changing color or being a different color. They'll actually be the same color as the part of the stem and the leaves that are outside of the water. So I do the same thing with the stems that are in the water, where I go over them with that light yellow first. I make sure to go over each of the 3 leaves as well. I'm not doing this with a wash, as I don't have my other little ceramic plate out, or little ceramic palette out. So I just have water on my brush and I'm dipping the brush into the yellow instead of making a wash. But you can make a wash of yellow and then use that light yellow wash to go over your stem and your leaves. I just wasn't too concerned about that, but if you don't have a lot of practice with water control, you might want to start off with the yellow wash and go over your stems and your leaves with the yellow wash, instead of going just right into the water and then right into the pan of paint. So now that those petals are dry, we're able to go into the other tulip petals, and I'm starting off with that same wash of Madder Rose and just painting in the entire petal that's right next to the one that's already dry, and then painting in the petal to the right of the petal that's already dry. I'm not going into the petal that's dry at all. I'm trying to be careful to not paint over it. And then I'm dabbing in, just like with the initial petals, I'm dabbing in a little bit of that color right from the pan, just very gently up the sides and down the back of those petals. The remaining petals are all done the same way as well, where they start off with the wash of the Madder Rose, and then I go into them with the Madder Rose straight from the pan, where I want the petals to be a little bit darker, just dabbing in that darker color to the base and up the center a bit, And then also at the very top, I added just a little to add a little bit more interest to the top of the petal as well. With tulips, some of them have a little bit of a different color at the top of the petals. That could be really pretty. If you want to drop in a little bit of violet or a little bit of orange, I think that would make a really pretty effect as well. And if you don't like it, you can always pick that color back up with your paper towel. But just remember, with some colors, they're harder to pick up with the paper towel. For example, the violets that I have in this set, once I put it down, I know that I'll be stuck with the violet there, or at least you can tell where the violet was. So next we have the leaves and the stems, and I'm using the mix that I'm kind of in love with right now, which is the emerald green and the burnt sienna mixed together. I make a wash of this by adding a few brushfuls of water to the dried wash that was already in the palette. And then I add a little bit more of the paints from the pans and test that color on my little scrap of watercolor paper. And you can really see a difference between when it's mostly the emerald green with just a little bit of the burnt sienna and when there's more of a 50-50 mix. You can use whatever green you want to for this, but if you're interested in the green that I'm using the emerald green mixed with the burnt sienna. So now I have a wash, and you can use whatever green you want again for this. And I'm going over the now very dry, so wait for the yellow to dry. I'm going over that very dry yellow, and this allows it to act like a glaze. So that yellow is shining through because the green wash is a very thin wash so that you can see that yellow coming up through it. It's not opaque. It's transparent, pretty transparent. So you can see that glow coming through. And then I'm adding just a little bit more to the leaf so that it's a little bit of a richer color. The nice thing about watercolor is you can always add more layers. Well, until a point, unless you want it to look like gouache where it's more opaque and chalky. You don't want to add too many layers unless you like that look. You can see that I'm soaking back up the stem with the paper towel, as I did not mean to go down the stem quite yet, as I want to keep it a lighter shade than the leaves. Again, the nice thing about watercolor is you can always soak it back up with a paper towel if you make a mistake. So then I follow that leaf all the way down into the water. As the water doesn't change the color of the leaves, at least for this vase, it's a very clear glass vase. And then I'm also going over the stems that are in the water, as I do want those the stems that are in the water to be a little bit darker, to have a little bit more weight, a little bit more of a darker hue than the top part of the stems. And then I go over that very last leaf, and I'm being careful not to paint over the top part of the stems, but I bring that color down into the water, especially onto the left-hand side of that thicker stem, as I'll want a little bit of shade on the left-hand side of the stem for the final painting, or the final look of the painting. And then I go over that last stem as well that's in the water. After rinsing out my brush, I go back into that wash of Madder Rose. So while everything in the glass vase is drying and the leaves are drying, we are going over those very last petals. Now that the rest of the petals of the tulip are completely dry, we're able to go over those back layer of petals and fill them in with the wash. And then, just as we did with those initial petals, the first petals, I am dabbing in a little bit of that color straight from the pan to add a look of a shadow. So this time I'm filling in that arch with the wash and then dabbing in the paint straight from the pan right on the line of that where that arch shape petal meets the initial petal. So it kind of looks like the sunshine is hitting the tulip and there's a bit of shading on the inside of the tulip. So the very top of those petals is lighter, and then as it goes in towards the center of the tulip, I'm just dabbing in a little bit more of that paint to give it more of a shadow look. The very last 3 little petals are done with just the wash. I did lose the footage for that part, so I just showed you very quickly what that looked like. Now for the lighter top part of the stems, I made a new wash where I used just about a brushful of that darker green that I had mixed up and added a couple more brushfuls of water to it so it is thinner, so it goes on lighter than the last green wash. And I'm going over the parts of the stem that I want to remain a bit lighter. You can see as I go over the already painted green part of the stem in the water that even though it's a very light wash, it does add a little bit more darkness to the part that has already been painted. So when you add more layers of paint to an already painted area, it will make that already painted area a little bit more darker, unless of course you're going over it with a paint that has been mixed up with white or a white paint. I then dab my paintbrush in the ultramarine blue and I'm adding that up the side of the stem for a little bit more shadow. I also add a little bit of it down the side of the lighter part of the stem that's outside of the water. And then for the next stem, I go back into that thinner wash of green and go over that initial yellow layer and then dab in just a little bit of ultramarine blue right up towards the top of these 2 stems to make it look like there's a little bit of shadow from the sun, to make them a little bit more 3-dimensional, give them a little bit more interest, make them just a little bit more real looking. And then for the one on the right, I'm bringing that shadow down along just the left-hand side of the stem. As that kind of lessened that shadow a little bit, I'm going back in and dabbing in just a little bit more of the darker paint. For this next stem, I'm going over that yellow first initial wash with the green as well. And then I'm going over those stems in the water as well. I add just a dab of the ultramarine blue into that initial wash of green that I had made, which was a mixture of the burnt sienna and the emerald green, just to have a slightly darker wash to go over the stems that are in the water. And then I also go along just the left-hand side of that stem that is in the forefront of the other stems. It just gives it a little bit more of a 3-dimensional look, and it gives a little bit more weight to that stem. I then go over that center stem again. I decided I wanted it to be just a little bit darker, and then changed my mind and soaked it right back up with the brush. To soak up color with a brush, you just need to dry off your brush a bit, maybe rinse it off and then dry it off a bit. And then you can use it like a sponge and soak back up some of the watercolor that you put down. And then I'm adding in some of that ultramarine blue right at the top, right underneath the petals for a little bit of a shadow. Once you're happy with your tulips and the stems and the leaves, and after they are completely dry, so use a hair dryer or let it sit for quite some time. Then you want to make the wash for the glass vase. So I used about 5 brushfuls of water and just a tiny little bit of the black coming right from my palette or the pan. And then I made sure to test it on my little scrap piece of watercolor paper so that it was just a barely there gray. So you can hardly see it. You can always add more if it's not dark enough, but especially with black and violets, it's hard to pick that color back up if it's too dark. And then I go down that first side on the left and I curve around that top line on the bottom, and then I go down the side on the right with that initial very, very light wash. It's almost as if you're outlining a coloring page, just drawing right along those lines. So you don't want the paint to be on the outside of your pencil line. You want the paint to be on the inside of your pencil line, on the inside of your vase. And then I paint along the line on the bottom. Again, it's just kind of like outlining a coloring book from when you're a kid. And then I add another line to that center curved line. And then I bring in just a little bit on each side. I'll slow that down for you so you can see what I do so that it looks like that thick part of the glass at the very bottom. I'm bringing in that wash just ever so slightly along the sides, but leaving a little bit of that white right in the center, so you kind of have 2 oval shapes of that dry white paper left in the center of the bottom of your glass. For this next part, we are going to be painting in another straight line down with that same very, very light shade of gray wash. So what I'm doing is I'm leaving a strip of white dry paper in between this shaded area that we're painting in now and the line that followed the line of your glass straight down. So you're painting an area where you have a white line of dry white paper separating the painted area from that first initial straight line down of the gray wash. I do the same on the other side, making sure to paint just in the water area. So starting from that top water line and filling in the area between the green of the stems until you meet the straight line down again of white paper that you want to leave. So it's like you're painting in just a little triangle of that light gray wash straight down from that water line, touching the green stems, and then leaving a strip, a straight line between that gray wash and the gray wash line that you did initially, following that pencil line. I then fill in any white paper space in between the stems at the bottom of the vase. So just going in between those very dry green stems and filling in that space with the light gray wash. If you don't have any space in between your stems, then you don't need to add it. I then go back into that gray wash and we're going to be adding another layer of that same gray wash right on top of that first initial thin line that we painted down the side. And we're just following the pencil line and just making that initial gray line just a shade or two darker, and going over that curve at the bottom on that first curve just a little bit, adding a little bit more color to that, and then going down over a portion of that second curved line, and then down to the very bottom, going about halfway to add a little more definition and a little more of a 3D effect. And then I go up to the very top of the vase, above the waterline, and I do the same thing there. And then I go along the waterline, and I'm adding just a line following that line of the waterline, a line of that gray wash. I then very carefully fill in the area of the vase on top of the waterline. So the area that you can see that is above that ellipse, the white ellipse of the waterline, don't paint into that white ellipse of the waterline. If you already have, you can just get it wet and pick it back up with a towel, because you want to keep that white ellipse of that waterline to be the paper white. So you're just painting in the area on top of your pencil line, filling in that area to the top of that white ellipse of the waterline, and then going in and adding another layer of the gray wash, just a little bit here and there to the vase where gray wash has already been put down. So you're not adding anything new, you're just going over that area of gray wash that is next to the stems, and you're not painting in any new areas. You're just darkening up that already painted gray area just a little bit by going over it with another layer of that very light gray wash. Then I'm adding in just a touch of that green wash to the still wet gray wash, but this is something you don't need to do. I just like to add a little bit of the green into the gray to make it look a little bit more realistic, but you can just keep it that light gray wash. If you want to play around, please do. You can add a little bit of green, a little bit of the pink, just to show a little bit of those reflections of the colors, but it is not necessary. And remember, you can always pick it back up with a paper towel if you don't like it, if you put too much of it in there. With that same gray wash, I then go over a little bit of the base of the vase, just adding a little bit more shading, a little bit more darkness of color to that area. So I'm going along the painted areas that I've already painted and adding another layer of that light gray wash to them. And then also adding in just a few more little tiny lines, and then going back over that line on the right hand side a little bit. And then very carefully with just the tip of the brush, going over that very top line of your glass vase, that opening of the vase with that same gray wash, just a thin line of gray wash over on top of the pencil line. Once that little line has dried, there are two ways to make that light white line on top of it. You can use a white gouache, or I'm using a white watercolor. So what I'm doing is I use a damp brush, not too wet, as I want this to remain a very thin line. Rub it on that pan of the white watercolor until you have enough on the tip of your brush, and then create that fine, thin white line right on top of that gray line that you've painted. Once your painting is completely dry, you can go over with a kneaded eraser or another soft eraser and erase any little pencil lines that still might be hanging around. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you next time.